The old man was already slipping when they wheeled him past the nurse's station. His breathing came in shallow, rattling pulls, each one sounding like it might be his last. The thin hospital blanket barely covered his shaking body, and his skin, deep brown, weathered by decades of work and sun, had gone ashen around the lips. One hand clutched his chest. The other gripped the side of the gurney like he was afraid the world might slide away if he let go.
"Sir, stay with me,"
the paramedic said, voice tight.
"We're almost there."
But they were already there. St. Matthew's Medical Center. Private, prestigious, spotless floors that smelled faintly of antiseptic and money. The kind of hospital where donors' names were engraved on walls and doctors wore confidence like cologne. The automatic doors hissed open. 82-year-old male, the paramedic called out. Severe chest pain, dizziness, shortness of breath. Vitals unstable. The gurney rolled to a stop. And then, nothing. No doctor rushed forward. No urgent orders were barked. No hands reached out. The paramedic looked up, confused. Behind the desk, a white-haired receptionist glanced at the old man, then back at her screen. Her fingers continued typing. Across the room, a tall white man in a crisp lab coat stood reviewing a chart. Dr. Richard Whitmore, senior cardiologist. He looked up. His eyes flicked to the gurney, then away.
"I need a doctor,"
the paramedic said, louder now.
"He needs to be seen now."
Dr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and took a step, not toward the old man, but toward a young white woman clutching her stomach in a wheelchair.
"Get her into exam 2, let's move,"
he said calmly. The nurse nodded and rushed to comply. The gurney with the elderly black man remained where it was.
"Excuse me, he came in before her,"
the paramedic said, anger creeping in. Whitmore didn't even look back.
"We'll get to him. Have him wait."
Whitmore said, dismissive. The word landed like a slap to the paramedic who stared at him and quickly said,
"Sir, he's not stable."
Whitmore finally turned, his face tight with irritation, as if inconvenienced.
"There are other patients. We're very busy,"
he said. Then he walked away. The gurney was pushed to the side of the emergency room, near a vending machine humming softly. A place where people waited when they didn't matter enough to interrupt the flow. The old man's breathing worsened. His name was Elijah Thompson. No one asked that yet. Minutes passed. A young couple arrived, white mid-30s. The man complained of chest tightness after jogging. They were rushed in immediately. A businessman with a gold watch and sharp voice arrived next. Elevated blood pressure. Seen within moments. Elijah lay there watching shoes pass by. White coats, scrubs, polished loafers. No one met his eyes. His chest burned now. Not sharp, heavy. Like a weight pressing down, squeezing life from his lungs. His fingers trembled as he reached weakly toward the desk. "Please," he whispered. No one heard. Except for one person. At the far end of the air, Nina Alvarez, a trainee nurse barely 6 months into her residency, froze mid-step. She had noticed him earlier. Not because of alarms or charts, but because he reminded her of her grandfather. The same tired dignity. The same quiet endurance. She watched another patient be ushered past him. Then another. Her jaw tightened. She approached the desk. Why hasn't he been seen? The receptionist didn't look up. "He's waiting." "For what?" Nina pressed. "For a doctor to be available." Nina turned. "Dr. Whitmore is right there." The receptionist shrugged. "Take it up with him." Nina didn't hesitate. She crossed the room, heart pounding, and stopped in front of Whitmore as he finished washing his hands. "Doctor," she said carefully, "the elderly gentleman who was brought in earlier, his vitals are unstable. He needs immediate attention." Whitmore dried his hands slowly. "I'm aware of him." "Then why hasn't he been seen?" Whitmore's eyes hardened. "Because I'm prioritizing patients who are more likely to." He stopped himself, exhaled sharply. "Nurse, this is not your call." "With respect," Nina said, voice steady though her hands shook, "this is an emergency department. He could be having a cardiac event." Whitmore leaned in slightly. "You're a trainee," he said quietly. "Learn your place." The words burned. Nina glanced back at Elijah. His eyes were half closed now. His chest barely rose. The black sedan did not belong in the emergency lane. It wasn't flashing lights or sirens that drew attention, it was the silence. The way it rolled to a precise stop. The way the driver stepped out first, scanning the entrance with professional calm. The way people felt something shift before they understood why. Inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, the late morning rush hummed as usual. Phones rang. Stretchers moved. Shoes squeaked against polished floors. Dr. Richard Whitmore was mid-laugh at the nurse's station. "Unbelievable," he said, shaking his head as he signed a chart. "Patients think WebMD makes them experts now." A few chuckles followed. Nina Alvarez stood a few feet away, pretending to focus on her clipboard. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't laughed much since the night Elijah Thompson had almost died waiting. She still remembered his breathing. The sound haunted her, thin, fragile, wrong. She'd replayed it in her mind during sleepless nights, wondering what would have happened if she'd stayed quiet. If she'd listened. If she'd obeyed. She didn't regret what she'd done. But she hadn't forgotten the look Whitmore gave her either. That look said, "I won't forget this." The automatic doors slid open. Conversation faltered. First came the driver, a tall black man in a dark suit, posture rigid, eyes alert. Then another man stepped through, carrying a slim leather portfolio. And then, Elijah Thompson entered. But this Elijah Thompson did not need a gurney. He walked unassisted, shoulders straight, his stride measured and assured. His silver hair was neatly trimmed. His beard was shaped with care. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, a crisp white shirt, and a tie the color of midnight. The deep lines in his face were still there, but now they spoke not of weakness, but of endurance. For a brief moment, no one recognized him. Then a nurse gasped softly. That's him." Whispers rippled outward like a dropped stone in water. "Wasn't he the one the old man from last week? He looks different." Whitmore looked up. At first, irritation flickered across his face. Another interruption. Then recognition hit. His smile vanished. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the counter. Elijah Thompson's eyes found his. And held. The silence thickened. Whitmore straightened, forcing composure. "Sir," he said stiffly, stepping forward, "can I help you?" Elijah smiled faintly. Not warmly. Not cruelly. Patiently. "Yes," Elijah said, his voice steady, resonant. "I believe you can." He glanced around the room, taking it in, the sterile walls, the framed donor plaques, the polished floors. His gaze lingered on the emergency bay to the left, the spot near the vending machine, where he had been left to wait. "I'm here for a meeting," Elijah continued. "With the board." A murmur broke out. Whitmore frowned. "The board meeting is private. You'll need to check in." The man with the portfolio stepped forward. "Dr. Whitmore," he said calmly, "my name is Harold Bennett. Legal counsel." He opened the portfolio and produced a folder. Inside were documents, signatures, seals. "I suggest you read these." Whitmore hesitated, then took the folder. His eyes scanned the page. The color drained from his face. This isn't possible," he muttered. Elijah took another step forward. "Oh, it's possible," he said gently. "It's been possible for a while now." The room suddenly felt too small. "What's going on?" someone whispered. Nina had stepped closer without realizing it. Her heart pounded as she stared at Elijah, barely recognizing the frail man she'd knelt beside days ago in this commanding presence. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered in his eyes. And gratitude. "Mr. Thompson," Whitmore said, his voice tight, "if there's been some misunderstanding." "There hasn't," Elijah interrupted calmly. "Which was worse. I was brought into this hospital 3 nights ago," Elijah said, his voice carrying. "I was in pain. I was struggling to breathe. I was told to wait." Whitmore swallowed. "I watched patients who arrived after me receive care," Elijah continued. "I watched the staff look through me. Around me. The room was deathly quiet now. I was ignored," Elijah said, "until someone decided my life was worth risking her own position." His gaze shifted. Nina froze. Every eye followed his. He turned fully toward her. "You," Elijah said softly. Her throat tightened. "You saw me," he continued. "You spoke up when it wasn't safe. You acted when it wasn't convenient." Nina felt heat rush to her face. "I just did what was right," she whispered. Elijah nodded. "That's never just anything." Whitmore cleared his throat, forcing a brittle smile. "Mr. Thompson, again, if there was any lapse in protocol." Elijah raised a hand. The gesture was small, commanding. "I didn't come here for an apology," he said. "I came here to take responsibility." He turned back to the room. "My wife and I founded the Thompson Health Trust 40 years ago," Elijah said. "We invested in hospitals like this one. Not to own them outright, but to support them." Murmurs grew louder. "When my wife passed," Elijah continued, his voice faltering for the first time, "I withdrew from public life. I let others manage our interests." He looked back at Whitmore. "3 months ago," Elijah said, "I began reviewing where our money was going. What kind of care it supported." Whitmore's hands trembled. "And last week," Elijah finished, "I experienced it myself." The truth settled like a weight. Harold Bennett spoke again. "As of 48 hours ago, the Thompson Health Trust exercised its controlling interest." He looked directly at Whitmore. "Mr. Thompson is now the majority owner of St. Matthew's Medical Center." The shock exploded. Voices overlapped. "That can't be. He owns the hospital? The old man?" Whitmore staggered back as if struck. "No," he whispered. No, this is absurd." Elijah stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You saw an old black man and decided he could wait," Elijah said quietly. "You decided his life was less urgent, less valuable." Whitmore shook his head. "I made a judgment call." "You made a biased one," Elijah corrected. The words were calm, precise, unavoidable. "I built my life believing institutions like this would outlast me," Elijah said. "That they would protect people when I could no longer protect myself." He gestured around the room. "Instead, I found indifference." Whitmore's voice cracked. "What do you want?" Elijah held his gaze. "I want accountability," he said. Security appeared at the edges of the room, not aggressive, but present. Effective immediately, Harold Bennett announced, "Dr. Richard Whitmore is relieved of his duties pending a full internal review." Whitmore's breath came fast. "You can't do this." "I can," Elijah said. "And I am." Whitmore's eyes darted around, searching for support. None came. "I dedicated my life to this hospital," he said hoarsely. "And you forgot why," Elijah replied. Whitmore was escorted away, his protests echoing down the hall. Silence followed. Elijah exhaled slowly. Then he turned back to Nina. "You saved my life," he said. Tears welled in her eyes. "Anyone would have." "No," Elijah said gently. "They didn't." He extended his hand. "I have a board meeting to attend," he said. "And afterward, I would like to speak with you about your future here." Nina stared at his hand, then took it. The grip was firm. As Elijah walked toward the elevators, the hospital seemed different. And for the first time since she'd started working there, Nina felt something she hadn't expected to feel at St. Matthew's Medical Center. The hospital did not celebrate its reckoning. There were no announcements over the intercom. No public statement yet. St. Matthew's Medical Center continued to function as it always had, patients arriving, nurses moving briskly, machines beeping in quiet rhythm. But beneath the routine, something fundamental had cracked. Dr. Richard Whitmore's name disappeared from the schedule by noon. His office door was locked. His parking space sat empty. And fear crept into places where confidence once lived. Nina Alvarez felt it everywhere she went. She felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. In the way some nurses smiled too brightly, while others avoided her eyes entirely. In the way administrators suddenly needed clarification for every small decision she made. She was no longer invisible. And invisibility, she was learning, had been safer. She stood in the supply room, hands trembling as she restocked 4 kits. Her heart still hadn't settled from the morning. From the way Whitmore had been escorted out. From the way Elijah Thompson had said her name like it mattered. About your future here. The words echoed. A future? She had wanted one here once. Now she wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Careful, a voice said behind her. You'll snap those gloves. Nina turned. It was Janice, the senior nurse who'd been at St. Matthew's for over 20 years. Her face was kind, but her eyes held something cautious. Sorry, Nina said, forcing a smile. Just a lot going on. Janice nodded. You could say that. They worked in silence for a moment. Then Janice spoke again. You should be proud of yourself. Nina paused. Not everyone agrees. Janice exhaled. Hospitals don't like mirrors. They show things people would rather not see. Nina swallowed. Do you think I did the right thing? Janice looked at her sharply. Do you? Nina thought of Elijah's labored breathing. His whisper of thanks. The weight of his hand in hers when he'd shaken it. Yes, she said. Janice smiled. Then that's all that matters. But it didn't feel like all that mattered. By mid-afternoon, Nina was called into an administrative conference room. Two men she'd never met before sat at the table. Both wore suits. Both smiled too thinly. Nina Alvarez, one said. Please, have a seat. Her stomach tightened. We're reviewing procedures related to last week's incident, the other man said. We just have a few questions. The questions were polite. Too polite. Why had she acted without authorization? Had she felt pressured? Did she understand the hospital hierarchy? Each one felt like a test. I assessed a patient in distress, Nina said evenly. That's my duty. The men exchanged a glance. Of course, one said. But protocol exists for a reason. So do ethics, Nina replied. Silence. They dismissed her with practiced smiles. As she left, she understood something with cold clarity. Doing the right thing had made her dangerous. Elijah Thompson sat at the head of the boardroom table. It was the same room where decisions had been made for decades. Funding approvals, expansions, donor recognitions. Now it felt different. Faces around the table shifted between discomfort and forced professionalism. Men and women who had never expected to answer to someone like Elijah. Let's be clear, Elijah said, his voice calm but unwavering. This isn't a witch hunt. A few shoulders relaxed. This is a correction, he continued. A necessary one. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were reports, data, patient wait times broken down by race, age, insurance status. The disparities were undeniable. I built my wealth in construction, Elijah said. I learned early that if a foundation is flawed, everything above it is unstable. He looked around. Your foundation is cracked. A board member cleared his throat. Mr. Thompson, hospitals are complex systems. Bias isn't always intentional. Elijah nodded. Intent doesn't heal patients. The room fell silent. Effective immediately, Elijah said, there will be an independent audit of emergency room practices, mandatory bias training, and a review of disciplinary protocols. Another board member stiffened. This could cause reputational damage. Elijah's eyes hardened. So does letting people die waiting. No one argued after that. Nina's shift ended late. She walked out into the parking garage, exhaustion heavy in her bones. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She reached her car. Ms. Alvarez. She turned. Elijah stood a few feet away, his driver at the respectful distance. Her heart leapt into her throat. Mr. Thompson, I didn't know. I didn't want to ambush you, he said kindly. May I walk with you? She nodded. They moved slowly through the garage. I know today has been difficult, Elijah said. Nina laughed softly. That's one word for it. He smiled. You disrupted a system that depended on silence. That always has a cost. She looked at him. I don't regret it. I'm scared. He stopped walking. So was I, he said. She turned to him, surprised. When my wife died, Elijah continued, I was angry at the world. I withdrew. I told myself institutions would carry the burden I could no longer carry. He shook his head. I was wrong. He met her gaze. Change doesn't happen because good systems exist, he said. It happens because good people refuse to look away. Nina's eyes burned. What happens now? She asked. Elijah reached into his jacket and handed her an envelope. She hesitated, then took it. Inside was a letter. An offer. A funded scholarship to complete her training. A guaranteed position upon graduation. A mentorship under a newly formed patient advocacy program. Her hands shook. I don't understand, she whispered. Elijah smiled gently. I do. He stepped closer. I don't want you protected. I want you empowered. Tears slipped down Nina's cheeks. I almost didn't speak up, she admitted. I was afraid. And you spoke anyway, Elijah said. That's the difference. Inside the hospital, rumors spread. Some staff resented the changes. Others welcomed them quietly. A few spoke up for the first time in years. Resistance came in subtle ways. Missed memos, delayed implementations, whispered complaints about overcorrection. Elijah noticed everything. He also noticed who resisted and who adapted. One afternoon, he walked past the emergency bay. The vending machine was gone. In its place stood a triage station. A small change, but meaningful. Elijah paused there, remembering the cold metal rail of the gurney beneath his fingers. The feeling of being invisible. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he walked on. Nina returned to work the next week with a different posture. Not arrogant, but steadier. She met resistance with professionalism, fear with compassion, doubt with quiet resolve. She was no longer just reacting. She was becoming. And the hospital, slowly, imperfectly, was becoming something else too. But consequences had a way of rippling outward. And not everyone was ready to accept them. The first public statement came 7 days later. It was printed on hospital letterhead and posted quietly on the St. Matthew's website. No press conference, no grandstanding. Just words. Carefully chosen. Long overdue. St. Matthew's Medical Center acknowledges failures in emergency response equity and commits to immediate structural reform. Some people skimmed it. Others read it twice. A few felt something loosen in their chest that they hadn't realized they'd been carrying for years. Inside the hospital, change did not arrive like a miracle. It came like construction, loud in some places, slow in others, uncomfortable everywhere. New policies were introduced. Old habits were challenged. Long-standing assumptions were dragged into the light and examined without ceremony. And not everyone survived the process. Dr. Richard Whitmore sat alone in a small office miles away from St. Matthew's, staring at a letter he had already read a dozen times. Employment terminated following internal review. No flourish. No softened language. Just consequence. For the first time in decades, no one was protecting him. He told himself it was unfair. That his career couldn't be reduced to one moment, one patient, one decision. But late at night, when the noise died down, another thought crept in, unwanted and sharp. Why had it been so easy to look away? That question followed him long after the anger faded. At St. Matthew's, Elijah Thompson walked the halls without an entourage now. He didn't want one. He stopped to speak to custodial staff by name. He asked nurses how their shifts were going and waited for real answers. He listened more than he spoke. In the emergency department, he watched a young Latino man receive immediate care for shortness of breath. He saw an elderly white woman reassured gently while waiting for imaging. He noticed how triage moved, more structured, more transparent. Not perfect but better. Elijah stood near the nurse's station when Nina finished a particularly long shift. You look tired, he said. She smiled. I am. But it's the good kind. They walked together toward the exit. You've changed this place, she said quietly. Elijah shook his head. No, you did. She stopped walking. I spoke up once. And that was enough to crack the wall, Elijah replied. Others are walking through the opening now. Nina thought of the new patient advocacy desk. The training sessions where people spoke openly for the first time. The moments of discomfort that led to something honest. I didn't know one moment could do all this, she said. Elijah smiled. Neither did I. They stood in silence for a beat. Then Nina asked the question she'd been holding for weeks. Why didn't you say who you were that night? Elijah looked at her, eyes thoughtful. Because I wanted the truth, he said. Not the performance. She nodded slowly. That night, Elijah continued, I wasn't an owner. I wasn't a donor. I wasn't powerful. He met her gaze. I was just a black man in pain. The words landed heavily. And that, he said softly, told me everything I needed to know. The audit results were released a month later. They were damning. Patterns of delayed care. Disparities in pain management. Inconsistent triage decisions that could not be explained by medical need alone. Some staff resigned. Others were retrained. A few were terminated. The hospital endured criticism. Headlines followed. Commentators debated. Some called it accountability. Others called it overcorrection. Elijah did not respond to the noise. He focused on outcomes. 6 months later, emergency wait times were down across all demographics. Patient satisfaction rose. Complaints of bias dropped significantly. Change, it turned out, was measurable. Nina stood at the front of a small auditorium one evening, hands clasped, heart pounding. She had been asked to speak, not because she was perfect, but because she had been honest. I used to think courage was loud, she told the room. I thought it looked like speeches or protests or confidence. She paused. But that night, she continued, I was terrified. My voice shook. My hands shook. And I almost stayed quiet. The room listened. I'm standing here because I didn't, Nina said. And because someone decided my fear didn't disqualify me from doing what was right. She looked out at the faces. Young nurses, doctors, administrators. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, she said, it's this: silence protects systems. Speaking up protects people. The applause was not thunderous. It was sincere. Elijah watched from the back. He thought of his wife, of the trust they'd built together, of the years he'd spent believing distance was the same as safety. He understood now that it wasn't. Before leaving, he stopped by the emergency department one last time. A patient lay on a gurney, frightened, clutching his chest. A nurse leaned close and spoke gently. I'm here, she said. We're taking care of you. Elijah nodded once. That was enough. The story did not end with perfection. Hospitals were still human institutions. Bias did not vanish overnight. Injustice did not evaporate because one man reclaimed power. But something irreversible had happened. A truth had been exposed. And once exposed, it could not be unseen. St. Matthew's Medical Center would never again be able to pretend it didn't know. Weeks later, Elijah returned home, settling into the quiet of a life that finally felt aligned. On his desk sat a framed photo, his wife smiling beside him, sunlight behind them. He touched the frame gently. We did some good, he murmured. And somewhere, in an emergency room that no longer looked quite the same, a young nurse began another shift, steady, alert, unafraid to speak. This story isn't about a racist doctor alone. It's about systems that reward silence. It's about how power reveals truth when it's absent, not when it's announced. And it's about how real change often begins with the smallest, bravest interruption. Because the question isn't who owns the building. The question is, who do we become when no one is watching? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you uncomfortable in the right way, tap like because stories like this matter. Subscribe so more conversations like this can reach people who need them. And most importantly, comment below. What would you have done in Nina's place? Have you ever witnessed silence protecting injustice? What responsibility do institutions have when bias isn't intentional, but lethal? Let's talk. Because stories don't change the world alone. People talking about them do.